Yeah, my name's Dan Pitman. I work for Logic as an architect, doing various things, cloudy stuff and security stuff, obviously. So I'm going to have a little talk about threat hunting and some of the practical stuff that we do within our research team and our SOC teams. So obviously, starting off with a sort of definition, or at least talking about what the difference is. And there's only one difference as far as we're concerned, right, between detection and hunting, and that's whether it's known and unknown threats. Detection, obviously, you know what you're looking for and you can write a good signature and it's nicely tuned and so on and so forth. Whereas hunting, you may not know what you're looking for. You're trying to find stuff that's unknown, but you still need to kind of know which bits you might want to look for or something to search for. And I kind of talk about that a bit today. Obviously, if anyone disagrees, you can not ask any questions later, maybe post it on YouTube. So look, let's set the scene, right? So this is the way we see security, is that you've got some really highly trained people in the middle, and they're, you've been training them for ages, and they're really highly specialized, but you haven't got very many of them normally. And then you've got a bucket load of attacks happening, right? Because most attacks these days that we see in our SOC, so we run a SOC as about 4,000 customers. We have a lot of data, and we see a lot of attack attempts and some attack success. And, that automation that drives those attacks is what's the biggest challenge, really. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about why automation is critical for threat hunting, even though obviously the people are still critical. So where do those things go? We've got our security team, we've got some attacks that we're able to thwart, but still we've got these inbound threats, right? And generally speaking, you're getting overwhelmed a lot of the time, especially if you run a small SOC and you've got a lot of data or you've got a large amount of systems to manage. It can be very difficult. And just to switch Star Wars program, what we want to build is our nice analytic defense, right? So obviously they're the good guys here, and it gets a bit confusing thanks to George, but building that analytic defense, building your clone army is going to be important, right? Because you can know some of what you're going to look for, but ultimately digging through all that data can be the biggest challenge. So what does that analytic defense automation look like? You want to match the behavior and the techniques of the attackers necessarily, not looking for a specific thing in a signature. It can be relatively trivial to do that at times if you've got a known attack, and I'm going to talk about that. But there are different ways to apply that automation. That's, like I say, is the core difference. Industrialization of attacking is a very real thing now. We've got countries where unemployment is very high around the world. And they have teams of people that are probably more organized than some of the companies I've been in to see, running those attacks and passing things around the world and attacking our customers. And so we really need to make sure that we can find these things. So if we talk about a known attack, and this is the shoplift bug from 2015, it was relatively easy to find, right? So we knew that the content we were trying to look for, we knew to look for this admin HTML and the forwarded equals. We could look for that within the URI. There was a community rule out. Ours is a bit more tuned than this one, obviously. So, if you see these things, then that's the attack being attempted. And you need to go and dig into the data, and that can be quite an easy thing for someone to do in their SOC, right? You take the community rule, maybe you tune it a little bit, but you build it into your IDS and you escalate it to someone who knows what they're doing, hopefully. But threat hunting is different, right? It's about finding what you don't know, like I say. It's not the same as zero-day hunting. Obviously, zero-day is something there isn't a patch for, but what we're trying to do here is find stuff that before it hits the public domain. So one of our big success stories in that case was WannaCry. We downloaded the Shadow Brokers packet. We were looking at it a month and a half in advance, able to understand what was going on, and our customers were protected from that. I'm not going to go on about WannaCry today, obviously. Everyone's talked about WannaCry forever. So one of the key things, though, is that automation is pervasive within all of it, right? Don't want to sort of labor on the differences, but definitely you need your own clone army of things to try and find things out. And you can use automation in both of these cases, but we're going to focus on threat hunting today, obviously. So what do you need to do to prepare, right? You need something. You obviously need data, right? So we've had Star Wars, now we've got Lord of the Rings. I'm not going to do Harry Potter, don't worry. And your automation is only as good as the data you've got, I would say, right? So we have a lot of data. One of our cheesy stats we throw around, we've got more data than Netflix, and that's the quantity of data. When you've got a large SOC, 4,000 odd customers, as I said, the amount of data that you collect, even just our event data, let alone log data, is massive. And so our challenge to sift through that and get into it is a really big deal for us, and that's why we need our own bespoke tools, and we need very, very clever people working in our research teams and our SOC, and that automation is critical. So what are we looking for in that data? There's some obvious things, right? Source IP, destination IP, etc. We've got a sort of generic payload on the right, on your right. we're going to focus on this payload body and the URI today, but, for that known attack, we know what we're looking for. We know we're looking for those things in the URI. We can find it out very easily. But when we're doing threat hunting, we don't necessarily have that luxury. We might know some little bits here and there, the admin HTML being hit might give us a clue, but obviously that's going to throw up a ton of false positives because that's hit when people are doing administration against that system, perhaps. So you want to collect a lot of data. But why not all the data, right? So there's a few reasons for that. And I love this tweet ages ago by James, kind of highlights why big data isn't their sort of panacea to everything. One of the big reasons for not collecting all the data, or at least trying to manage the data properly, is cost. There are SAN vendors whose entire strategy is based on selling to people who run SIEM tools and want to keep, especially financial organizations, who want to keep their data forever, or at least 7 years. And so that means a huge amount of data being stored. You don't necessarily want to compress it because obviously that takes longer if you want to go back and do post-incident analysis. If you do collect a lot of data, then you need to do some good stuff with it, right? You need to normalize it. You need to know that the timestamps are normalized between different systems. Maybe they're in different parts of the world or they're just drifted a little bit. So you need to do that. And obviously you need to categorize, right? If you want to search in your data, and this is a big challenge for us, then just searching carte blanche throughout your entire data set will take a long, long time. So you want to be able to categorize that and look for specific things. And that's the kind of thing, you can do with increasing volumes and diversity of data, is making sure you categorize and normalize appropriately. So what strings can we pull out? There's some obvious ones, right? Some boring stuff like source IP and destination IP. Source IP for us is one of those interesting things because obviously we all know that keeping IP reputation has a diminishing kind of return on investment because attackers shift IPs, but it's much better then to try and look for the IPs that are in their controlling infrastructure. If we think about, if you saw my talk yesterday, I talked about the dropper systems, the infrastructure that they're managing that will host the web shell or host the piece of malware that they pull down when they're doing a remote code execution. That's unlikely to shift. That's going to have a more static IP, not completely static, obviously, but they might use a domain or something like that. We can keep track of those things rather than looking for the specific attacker IP because that's just going to change all the time. There's other bits and pieces, like in the headers, Apache structure is quite a common one to look for in headers and so on. User agent, obviously they can spoof this, but you can often tell if they're not particularly bright whether they're automating things. But we're going to focus on payload body for some of the examples I've got. We find it definitely to be generally the more useful when you're looking for attacks and you're doing threat hunting because it contains the richest amount of information. And this is where that expertise comes in, right? This is where some of the guys that are here today from our SOC really add value to us because they're able to dig into this data and understand and start to tree out as far as where they need to look and we can start to return that information back into our research and content teams to generate what we would call telemetry signatures or more wideband signatures to pull in more data to do some great threat hunting. So I'm going to talk about these two, relatively old, but obviously that means that they're still out there. We all know the vulnerabilities don't disappear within 6 months. And I think that Struts one is the one that was really most damaging in that year. So we've seen successful attacks for both of these, and they're still being exploited, like I say. So there's obviously an exploit DB record. Those of you who don't know what exploit DB is, it's a great resource for attackers and defenders alike. So you can go on there. You'll see proof of concept code sometimes. And so if you're looking for a known attack, it can be very useful. And sometimes you get proof of concept code, like I say, but often you'll get some kind of payload information like this. We're not going to go into the specifics of how this works, but we can see that there are certain potential content matches within this. So we can see that different parts we could use to build a signature or do some threat hunting on, or specifically find this attack. One of the interesting ones in here is the process builder. So this is the way that the Java execution is run remotely or within the payload. And so you can build up this process basically and run a command. And this is the one that, was useful to us in these examples. So now we're starting to talk about how we're going to hunt, right? So if you start to build a signature using Process Builder, there's kind of two outcomes. If you've got low data volumes, if you're relatively small SOC with a relatively small set of systems, maybe it only fires for known attacks. It's not really adding value on top of your existing signature set. It might not fire at all. It might fire on some benign use. Maybe you're actually using Process Builder internally to do some stuff between your applications. So you just turn it off, right? And you sort of feel like you might have wasted a bit of time. Go do something else, have a coffee, whatever. If you've got high data volumes, obviously you can just get swamped, right? So you might you might feel the same, that you're not really getting any value out of it. Or you might just sample bits of data and start to see benign use and discard the process again. No value, go do something else, right? You might be able to use that data later for forensics, and obviously that has use, but again, we've got that data storage problem. So this is why automation is really important. So back to this view of our attackers and whether or not we've got enough manpower is important, right? So we want to build that automation out. So what do we need? We need dedicated resources to be investigating the data. We need them supported by dedicated tooling. This is something obviously we can do with Alert Logic because we build and develop all our own tooling. So we can build and develop tools for our SOC and for our researchers, whether that be automation to go and grab bits of malware that we've seen attack attempts being used within, or whether it's within the SOC itself and searching through data using different tool sets, or to be ready when this WebLogic thing dropped to the world, and actually dropped on a Saturday. You can see, probably not in the little Chinese thing, it's a Saturday, released on this Chinese blog. So that's how we found it. We dropped in and we were able to find this Chinese blog. We were able to obviously translate it and speak to people internally and work out what was going on. It wasn't just on the blog, it was on Twitter as well. I don't know how many people are monitoring Twitter for new attacks or emerging threats, as we call them, but it wasn't all so bad. But ultimately it was on the 23rd of December, so not fantastic, right? But our guys were there and working, and they were trying to work this through and understand what was going on within the attack. And again, we saw this process builder thing, right? So we started to realize that this was obviously a good way of detecting attacks, not just these specific ones, but other attacks that might be happening. This was months later, obviously, after the WebLogic stuff, after the Strut stuff. So yeah, Merry Christmas. We knew that process builder was involved again, and we can look again and see what we could do to use that for some threat hunting, right? So let's look at that WebLogic stuff. So let's pretend we didn't know about it. We didn't know about WebLogic. We were still collecting data for threat hunting purposes. We'd use the struts as to inform us that we needed to look for process builder. We wanted to have a look for a generic Java signature to detect attacks against Java from the outside. And so we have this payload, right? So we'd never seen this async response service before. We knew this process builder was in there, and there was this nasty PowerShell command coming in through the string within the payload. So not fantastic, but we knew maybe that we wanted to look for process builder. So we really need to pay attention to these three things. And then we're on a threat hunt, right? We start to do some analysis. So if we're doing a blind analysis, we maybe weren't be sure about what was going on within this payload. We wouldn't necessarily know that the process builder was a nice way of finding an attack. What do I do? Do I try and run it myself? Does the URI look anything like we have internally? And it was a 500 response, which is kind of important. A lot of the time people assume it's 500, so it's an error, so it's not a success. But actually in this case, 500 was an indicator of success. And so because we'd done this research beforehand, we knew that, and we knew that was important. And it's that classic needle in a haystack, or needle in a needle stack, as one of my colleagues sometimes calls it. Right at that point of time, right, in that at the end of December in 2017, the amount of traffic was very, very low. So we wouldn't have been having high hits from a more tuned signature. But the point is that you want to be able to detect these things early on. If you wait until it's in the public domain, if you wait, like we say, 6 months later, when the traffic was much higher, and you would have been seeing a much higher hit rate from that signature, and maybe it would have drawn attention in your very tuned system, it's too late, basically. They've already built out the attack. They've already got over the hump of things not working, or their automation not really being fantastic, and systems are being attacked. So having that early warning system generated from automation and generating from your threat hunting is really where we can get value for our customers. So the point is you need to optimize for this new stuff, right? Build automated systems looking for generic exploit code, something that is used externally to run commands, or part of an RCE, not that specific URI, but the part of the payload that lets you see what was happening, or lets you give an early warning to your SOC and someone who can go and look at it. That security expertise is where it really is critical there, because they're the ones that are able to sort of correlate out and understand what that means, and look at the rest of the payload and understand it. And so it's imperative you need a high-grade security expertise within the SOC, or within a third party. So more recently, we've had Drupal, which was also quite interesting, very damaging. Another RCE. So Drupal made an advisory out, and we could see obviously that this was going to be significant again. And this was in the core code of Drupal, is something I touched on yesterday. Not a plugin, another way of running commands within Drupal, which was exploitable externally. So again, we've got an exploit DB record. The majority of vulnerabilities end up with one at some point, but normally this is a good way of telling whether or not it can be exploited or not, or whether something's going to get better or worse. So it meets the same bar as the WebLogic one, basically. So again, we can start to see some bits going on. So one of the core parts of the vulnerability was them trying to send this GET request with the format, and we could see a curl request pulling down file.sh. Obviously, it wasn't called file.sh. We've changed that. There's a difference between the payload and the actual vulnerability here, in that from the exploit DB record, we could write an idea to catch the vulnerability itself, but the payload was something that wouldn't have been appearing on that exploit DB record. So again, we can start to look at this data and work out ways of understanding how to catch other similar attacks using curl or something else. And you can only get that from looking at the actual exploitation traffic, not just from the vulnerability data that was released by the company or the exploit DB record. So what's the next steps for that hunt, right? So they're using curl. What about wget? Maybe they're using that. You might want to write some data capture mechanisms to look for that. What's that? This IP, has the IP address hit and anything else recently, obviously? And what's that payload attempting to do? Is it running another payload? Is it downloading something? Is it trying to deploy some kind of crypto miner or something else? And can you use that to generate more threat hunting data collection methods? And importantly, obviously, what does the command and control look like? Can we write detect code for that? And can we find out what that happens, the stages after that initial curl attempt? So none of these steps really require the attack to have been successful. This could have been an early warning. Your threat detection has generated leads for your threat hunting. Right? Hasn't necessarily detected the success of the attack, but your people are able to then go and look for other attacks that come along later. And that's what's important, is that, we can get a signature from a community store, we can get have it from our vendor that supplies our IDS, and we're going to understand necessarily the output of that and maybe tune it for our own purposes. But threat hunting is about finding things that we don't know about. Right. And finding things that might be suspicious, and a human being, can then go and investigate without them trawling through huge amounts of unstructured data, and obviously useful for forensics. If you see that file sh on any of your boxes or with any other vulnerability or any other traffic, then you can start to understand that maybe that's a similar kind of attack, and it's an alarm bell. So we generate what we'd call a virtuous circle. So you understand one threat. You start to look at that threat, whether it's in the URI or somewhere else. You extract the payload. You start to dig into the payload. You maybe try and execute it somewhere, build an environment, analyze the different aspects of the attack, analyze the command and control, come back around, have another look at the threat, extract the URI, analyze the URI, and you end up with this nice virtuous circle of trying to find attacks that you don't know about, that aren't necessarily in the public domain, which is always too late, really. So analyze that CNC and perhaps release some more content for that, and build up a nice virtuous circle, basically, and within your process. And some people in more operational roles might call this continuous improvement. And we've largely automated a lot of this and operationalized that threat hunting capability within your data set. So we end up with our clones fighting clones, right? So attacker uses some new vulnerability. They might drop the same payload. We've caught it, right? Because the payload was similar. They might use a new payload in the same campaign. So it's using a similar part of the payload, that process builder or something. We've caught it again. And that's the point. You end up with, an ever sort of increasing amount of, increasing detection capability, basically, via your threat hunting mechanism. Another way of looking at it is this threat tree. So you can imagine that this carries on off the bottom of the slide, obviously, that you build up a nice idea of a certain threat, and you can understand the new payload that was in that threat and start to understand a new threat from that, and then you'll get a new payload out of that one and carry on and going. Maybe not forever, but certainly there's very little new under the sun, which we should realize. And attackers in it are inherently lazy most of the time, so they're going to reuse stuff, right? And that's often what we see. And so you'll soon reach a plateau where there's very little new to be discovered, and you're able to automate that threat hunting. So, summary of what I talked about so far: it can give you advance notice of attacks, right? going on that you didn't know about, something new or something weird or a different approach to an existing exploit that we're out there. It's obviously really easy to throw these up in bullet points, but that capability is directly tied to the amount of data you have. Right, and how you manage that data, most importantly. It's all very well having huge reams of data, but the automation you invest in it and the people that drive that automation, whether it's traditional or machine learning. And ultimately, you can't necessarily be ahead of that attacker, but you can walk right directly in his shadow. So hopefully you're seeing the attacks when they're attempts, not successes, which is really our goal at Alert Logic. If you think about, having 4,000 different companies within our common platform and all the data that comes in, and think about the IP address space of our customers, it's very long, I suppose you could put it that way. And hopefully we're going to see something very early on, build detection content, and then discover it for the rest of our customer base before they get to some vulnerable system that's down here. In a normal organization or with a much smaller IP address space, you have a much shorter amount of time. And that's I was once a customer of Alert Logic, and that's kind of what I bought into, right? I had a much better chance of being protected from attack because I would most likely be down here if I patched reasonably regularly. So a bit of summary of kind of our process really. And last slide, there's no sales slides in this one. So we'll take data from a lot of different sources, and that's the point. So it's not just about the network. Obviously, we look at the cloud now. Everyone's moving into cloud, and most people have got some kind of cloud platform. So taking the logs, the audit logs, the access and change logs from the cloud is very important, as we have traditionally done on-premise. Pulling in data from containers. Containers are obviously much more widespread than they were even a year ago. And so monitoring that is really important. And we built a native container solution that you can take out the repo and drop into your host, and it monitors that inter and intra-container traffic. And obviously different connected devices, firewalls, etc., and taking logs from those and feeding it into our back-end platform through some of the processes that I've talked about today to make sure that we can analyze that data and escalate incidents into our SOC. So we raise a significant amount of incidents through our SOC. I talked about some of those numbers yesterday. But then the point is using the different mechanisms, whether they're signatures and rules and traditional methods, or whether it's more modern human or a system anomaly detection or some machine learning stuff for false positive reduction. We can understand whether something's medium or low, or it's informational. And ultimately, you don't want to be woken up at 3:00 in the morning. You want an email or something like that, or whether it's critical and high, it needs to be looked at by a person as quickly as possible. You see, we've got this 15-minute SLA we give them, which is pretty tight, to determine whether or not we should wake our customers up if it's out of hours, and get that to them in a way that describes their next actions, right? Ultimately, our customers understand their systems, the business, and we understand security, and those two things work well together. So that's me. I'm a little bit ahead of time, but if we'll see if anyone's got any questions, then I can take them, or hopefully it's been useful.
Hi, so two questions, if I may. One is, how do you deal with HTTPS? Are you just on the one side of the TLS offloading? And then my second question would be, how do you know your customer's network? So one of the issues we face, having recently merged with another company, is we see stuff like WordPress attacks, and then we have to question, well, are we even using WordPress? Does this matter? That sort of thing.
Okay, so yeah, TLS or SSL. So yeah, we're at the other side of the offload, generally speaking. It depends what we've deployed. So if we've deployed our WAF, we can obviously man in the middle of that and have their certificate on the WAF, or we're going to decrypt it on our agent on the host. So we have different mechanisms. We'll have an agent, or we'll plug into a spam, but either way, we're going to decrypt that. We need the certificate. It varies. Customers' networks, that's obviously a big challenge. It's easier in the cloud because you've got a lot of APIs you can hook into. We're going to use our scan data, so we deploy our vulnerability scanners, and they'll hopefully run regularly. And so we can use that scan data to build an asset model. If you'd seen our system, you see we build up a nice topology map of the environment, and we can understand that. But that's where security is always a partnership, right, between engineering and operations and security, to make sure that the language you're being used and the way you communicate them is in context. But that scan data would tell us if the WordPress is in the environment. One of the things I talked about yesterday was our emerging threat process, and that's where that scan data is really useful. If we see a new emerging threat, something hot like that Drupal one was, then we can use that scan data to proactively reach out and say, hey, you're vulnerable, right? You want to patch this. This is going to get bigger and going to get worse. So there's a mixture of approaches.
Any more questions? No?
Sweet.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everyone.